Have you ever been talking in English and you just can't think of the right word? Like it's right there on the tip of your tongue, but gone.
Oh, yeah, I know that feeling.
Or maybe you just, get that nervous feeling when you have to speak up in English.
It can be pretty intimidating.
Totally. So if any of that sounds familiar, well, you're in the right place. Because today we are diving deep into a really, really interesting approach to becoming more fluent and confident in English.
It might even sound surprising to some people.
Yeah, it's all about storytelling.
Storytelling, exactly.
Hold on. We're not talking about writing a novel or anything. More like sharing everyday experiences, those little stories that make up our lives.
And the research we've been digging into suggests it can be really powerful.
Yeah, powerful for learning English. I mean, think about it. We all have stories, right? And the cool thing is that this approach, it can work whether you're just starting out or you're already pretty comfortable speaking English. The sources we've looked at really make the case that using storytelling can help you become more fluent, more confident, and, just sound more natural when you speak.
That's the goal, right? To sound natural and confident.
Absolutely. So that's what we're going to explore in this deep dive. What's the deal with storytelling? Why does it work so well for language learning? And we'll get into some practical tips and techniques you can actually use.
Sounds good. Let's unpack it.
All right, so first things first. Why storytelling for fluency? It might seem a bit odd when you first hear it.
Right, it's not the traditional textbook approach, but the sources highlight some pretty compelling reasons why storytelling can be so effective. One of the biggest things is that it really helps you start thinking in English directly.
That makes sense. I mean, I've definitely been there where I'm trying to translate everything in my head and it slows everything down.
Exactly. And translating word for word, well, it can actually create a real barrier to fluency. What's interesting about storytelling is that it sort of bypasses that translation process. You get so caught up in the flow of the narrative that you start to naturally think and express yourself directly in English.
So it's like you're not overthinking every single word or grammar rule. You're just in the moment telling a story.
And that's when the magic happens. The research even suggests that this sequential way of thinking, the way we tell stories, might actually align with how our brains naturally process language.
Huh. So maybe storytelling taps into something really fundamental about how we think. I like that. And it's not just about thinking in English, right? The sources also suggest that storytelling can really boost your vocabulary and grammar almost without you realizing it.
Yeah, it's like a sneaky way to learn. Instead of memorizing lists of words or trying to cram grammar rules, you're learning naturally in context. You're seeing how words are actually used, how they fit together in sentences, and how different tenses work together to tell a story.
It's much more engaging than just staring at a textbook, for sure.
Absolutely. And who doesn't love a good story, right?
Exactly. It makes learning fun, which is so important because if you're not enjoying it, well, you're probably not going to stick with it. And the sources we've looked at also emphasize how storytelling can actually build your confidence in speaking English.
That makes sense because when you're telling a story, you're not just reciting memorized phrases. You're sharing something personal, something you care about, and that can really help you relax and just be yourself.
Yeah, and even if you're a little nervous, the structure of a story can kind of give you a roadmap. You know where you're starting, where you're going, and how you're going to get there.
Exactly. It provides a framework to work with, which can make speaking up in English feel much less daunting. Plus, when you're telling a story, you naturally use your voice to express emotion and emphasis. You might pause for effect or raise your voice at certain points, and that actually helps with pronunciation and intonation too.
Right. You're not just speaking in a flat monotone. You're putting feeling into it.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes a huge difference in how you sound and how people perceive you.
Exactly. So storytelling, it's good for fluency, good for vocabulary, good for grammar, and good for confidence. It's like a multivitamin for your English skills.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So we've talked about why storytelling is so powerful for learning English. Now let's get practical. How can someone actually start using this technique to improve their English? What do the sources recommend?
Well, the most common piece of advice is to start with personal stories, things you already know really well.
Like what kind of things?
It could be anything, really. A childhood memory, that funny thing that happened to you yesterday, a trip you took, a lesson you learned.
Oh, I see. So it's not about inventing elaborate tales.
No, not at all. It's about using what you already have. Because you're so familiar with the content, you can really focus on finding the right English words and putting them together in a way that makes sense. You're not struggling to remember what happened.
That takes the pressure off for sure. And then to help with structuring those stories, The sources recommend using frameworks like the who, what, when, where, why, and how.
Right. That's a classic technique used in journalism, and it works really well for storytelling too. By thinking through each of those elements, you make sure you're covering all the bases. You're telling a complete and coherent story that people can easily follow.
It's like a checklist to make sure you're not missing any key information.
Exactly. And speaking of structure, the sources also talk about using the classic three-act structure, like you see in movies and
Oh
plays.
yeah, the beginning, the middle, and the end.
Right. It sounds simple, but it's super effective. The beginning is where you set the scene and introduce the characters. The middle is where the main action happens, the conflict or the problem. And the end is where you wrap everything up, the resolution or maybe the lesson learned.
It's a formula that's been working for centuries, so it makes sense to use it for storytelling in English too. And here's a tip from the sources that I think is really valuable, even though it might be a little intimidating at first.
What's that?
Recording yourself.
Ah, yes. That can be a little scary hearing your own voice played back to you, but it's honestly one of the best ways to improve your speaking.
Yeah, the sources really emphasize this point because when you listen to a recording of yourself, you become so much more aware of how you sound, your pronunciation, your intonation, the rhythm of your sentences, any grammar mistakes you might be making. It's like getting an instant feedback loop.
And you can really focus on specific areas you want to work on.
Exactly. It takes some courage, but it's worth it. Now, it's not just about sitting down and having these formal storytelling sessions, right?
Yeah.
The sources also talk about the importance of incorporating storytelling into everyday conversations.
Yes, that's where the real magic happens. Instead of just giving short, one-word answers, try to find opportunities to tell a little story, even if it's just a quick anecdote.
Like if someone asks, how was your weekend?
Hmm.
Instead of just saying, oh, it was good, you could tell a little story about something fun you did.
Exactly. It keeps things interesting, and it gives you a chance to practice your English in a natural way. And here's another tip from the sources that I really like: learning from people who are great storytellers, like watching TED Talks or listening to podcasts.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. I do that all the time. It's amazing how captivating a good storyteller can be.
Right. And what's great is that you can actually learn a lot by paying attention to what they do, like how they use their voice, their pauses, even their body language if you're watching a video. And then you can consciously try to incorporate some of those techniques into your own storytelling.
So it's kind of like imitation is the sincerest form of flattery.
Exactly. But in this case, it's also a really effective way to learn. And for people who are looking for more structured practice, where they can get feedback from others, joining an English-speaking club is a great option.
Yeah, I was going to say the sources actually recommend that as well. It's a really supportive environment where you can share your stories and hear other people's stories.
And you learn so much from listening to other people tell stories, too. You pick up new vocabulary, you get exposed to different accents, you see how other people structure their stories.
Yeah,
It's all really valuable input.
definitely. And the sources also mention the importance of using visuals and gestures when you tell a story, which makes sense, especially if you're giving a presentation or trying to really bring a narrative to life.
Yeah, body language is a huge part of communication. And when you're telling a story, your facial expressions and gestures can really help to emphasize certain points, convey emotion, and just generally keep people engaged.
So don't be afraid to use your hands.
Exactly. And here's a practical tip for practicing different tenses. Try telling the same story, but in different tenses.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So you could tell the story in the past tense, like, this is what happened to me last week. Then you could tell the same story in the present tense, like, this is happening right now. And then you could even try telling it in the future tense, like, this is what I plan to do tomorrow.
I've never thought about it that way.
Yeah,
But it makes sense. It forces you to really think about how to use different verb forms correctly.
exactly. And it keeps things interesting. It's like a mini challenge.
I like that. And finally, one of the most important pieces of advice from the sources is to keep your stories simple and clear.
Ah, yes. Don't try to be too fancy. Fluency isn't about using big words or complicated grammar. It's about communicating your message effectively.
Right. Focus on getting your point across in a way that people can easily understand.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, that's what matters most.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about why storytelling is so effective for learning English, and we explored some practical tips on how to use it. Let's recap some of the key benefits that the sources highlight.
Okay, sure. So one of the biggest benefits is that storytelling helps you to start thinking in English directly, which, as we discussed, can really speed up your fluency.
Right. It's like you're training your brain to process language in a more natural and intuitive way. And another key benefit is vocabulary expansion.
Absolutely. When you're telling stories, you're constantly using new words and phrases. And because you're using them in context, they're more likely to stick in your memory.
And it's not just about speaking. Storytelling can also help to improve your listening skills.
Right, because you're exposed to different accents, different speaking styles, and different ways of expressing ideas. And of course, as we've already talked about, storytelling can really boost your confidence.
Because you're practicing, you're getting better, and you're seeing that you can actually communicate effectively in English. And when you feel confident, you're more likely to speak up, you're more likely to take risks, and you're just generally more likely to enjoy using the language.
It's a positive feedback loop. The more you practice, the better you get, the more confident you feel, and the more you want to practice.
And it's not just about becoming a more fluent and confident speaker. Storytelling can actually help you become a better communicator overall.
Exactly, because when you're telling a story, you're not just conveying information. You're engaging people's emotions, you're connecting with them on a personal level, and you're making your message more memorable. And these are skills that are valuable in all aspects of life, not just when you're speaking English.
So to sum it all up, if you're serious about improving your English, storytelling is a fantastic tool to add to your arsenal. It's fun, it's engaging, and it can have a really powerful impact on your fluency, your confidence, and your overall communication skills.
Absolutely.
So what's the first step for our listeners?
If you're inspired to give storytelling a try, the sources we've looked at have a very clear call to action. First, choose a simple story from your own life. It doesn't have to be anything epic or groundbreaking, just something you feel comfortable sharing.
Right. Could be something that happened yesterday or something that happened years ago. The important thing is that it's your story.
Exactly. And once you've chosen your story, practice telling it out loud in English. Don't worry about making mistakes. Just focus on getting the story out.
And then take a deep breath and hit record.
Yeah, record yourself telling the story. And then listen back to the recording. Don't be too critical of yourself. Just pay attention to how you sound. Are there any words or phrases you're struggling with? Are there any grammar mistakes you're making? Is your pronunciation clear?
And once you've listened to the recording, pick one or two things you want to focus on improving. It could be anything. Maybe you want to work on your pronunciation of a particular sound, or maybe you want to practice using a specific grammar structure.
The key is to focus on one or two things at a time. Don't try to fix everything at once.
Right, small steps. And then once you feel comfortable with your story, share it with someone.
Yeah, find a friend, a language exchange partner, or even an online community where you can practice speaking English. The more you share your stories, the more confident you'll become.
And remember, fluency isn't about perfection. It's about being able to communicate effectively. So don't be afraid to make mistakes. Just keep practicing, keep telling your stories, and most importantly, have fun with it.
Absolutely. Enjoy the process.
So the big takeaway here is that storytelling is more than just entertainment. It's a powerful tool for language learning and personal growth. And the best part is that everyone has stories to tell. Your stories are unique and valuable, and they have the power to connect you with others, even across language barriers. So what stories are you waiting to share? What experiences have shaped you? What lessons have you learned? And what insights do you have to offer the world?
Those stories are waiting to be told, and in the process of telling them, you might just discover a whole new level of fluency and confidence in yourself and your English.
Beautifully put. So go out there, find your voice, and start telling your stories. That's where true fluency begins.